looking at tortoise conservation projects, and I tried to visit some of the most critically endangered species and look at people who were trying to protect them. Came back and wrote this book, The Last Tortoise. And so the talk I'm going to give you tonight, I've been here before talking about work I've been doing with my students on, Burmese mountain tortoises in Thailand and impressed tortoises, and I'll mention those tonight. But really, the talk I'm giving you is kind of a summary of what I learned, what went into the book, and what I've been talking about for the past 6 months since the book came out. So, just some numbers, and I know some of you are really familiar with tortoises and their history and their problems, but just to get everybody kind of on the same page, depending on how you divide tortoises up into subspecies or races, you might say there are about 85 or so varieties of tortoise. That includes subspecies and their subspecies, most of which are endangered species. So that's the first thing to say. And that applies to many, many animals. The majority of animal species in a given group are endangered these days. But tortoises, I think, critically so. And more than 20 species are critically endangered, meaning there might only be anywhere from 1,000 down to a few, down to a handful that are left, at least in the wild. And then I'm always amazed. I mean, my basic premise about tortoises, which I'm sure many of you agree with, is that I've studied some amazing animals. You know, I've studied mountain gorillas and been out in the field with elephants in Africa. But if a biologist from some other galaxy came to Earth, I think that he'd be more amazed by tortoises than just about any other animal, because of their anatomy being so completely bizarre, their long, slow lives, and their kind of dinosaur-like appearance. I just find them really amazing. The size range is really impressive too, right? They go from tiny, tiny Egyptian tortoise, 4 inches long, or spider tortoises, up to Aldabra and Galapagos. That's a size range that's really incredible. And then the numbers that are really depressing and alarming are the numbers that are being smuggled every day, the numbers that are being consumed by people every day, mostly in Asia. I actually got involved with tortoise research originally after having kept tortoises because I was in Myanmar, in Burma, and I was traveling around looking for places where I might set up a primate project, so my day job. And I was with a couple of veterinarians, and we passed by a truck that was stopped by the side of the road by the police, and we stopped too because they seemed to know what was going on, my two leaders basically, and it was police had confiscated a truckload of turtles and tortoises that were heading for the Chinese border. There's no border crossing control at all, and so the smuggling of everything from drugs to food to basic supplies to turtles and tortoises is just a huge scale. And the truck was filled with elongated tortoises, hundreds and hundreds, and then lots and lots of aquatic turtles, soft-shell turtles and others. And they were confiscated. Most of them most likely died. I'll show you a slide later where the elongated tortoises ended up. And I was then kind of alerted, I was made aware of the scale of the problem. And it really is an incredible problem. So they've been around a long time. 200 million years is basically the evolutionary history for tortoises. The first modern tortoise that you'd recognize as a tortoise about 60 million years ago, which is about the time the dinosaurs went extinct. There's one of these, not a myth, tortoises live a long time. We all know that you can have a tortoise that will outlive you, but the theoretical maximum lifespan, which might be close to 200 years, is really different from the average lifespan. So we know, for instance, that desert tortoises, our own desert tortoises out in the California desert, you find them, people find them crossing the road when they're out on vacation somewhere. They look really ancient, but usually they're really young. So the average lifespan might be 30 to 40 years for a desert tortoise, because things happen, right? Droughts happen, and car accidents happen, and falls off of cliffs happen. So the animals have a theoretical lifespan that's really, really long, but they don't usually get anywhere close to it. So they have a limited time to reproduce and replace themselves. And the amazing thing, one of the amazing things we've learned in recent years about turtles and tortoises is that, I said their eternal fertility is that obviously in most animals, including us, including human animals, as a female gets older and older and older, her fertility gets less and less and less until it simply ends. In turtles and tortoises, as females age, they become more fertile, at least up to some point. So we know that an 80-year-old Blandings or painted turtle female is more fertile than she was when she was 20, which is kind of amazing that she's actually cranking out more eggs and more babies every year. But really, I'm talking today about tropical tortoises in the tropics. And most of the work that I've done and my students are doing is in the third world somewhere where the problems are different than they are here. And of course, they're often more severe because third world problems are just more severe in general. So let me do this. Let me run through a few of the obvious problems and threats to the existence, continued existence of tortoises. And all is not lost, so sometimes it sounds like a bleak topic, but it isn't necessarily. And then we'll come back and look at some of the most critically endangered tortoises, and I'll focus during this on a couple of the species that I've been doing work with with my students, pancake tortoises recently, and also impressed tortoises for the last few years. So the big problem is always habitat loss. Here's an island in the Indian Ocean where there used to be giant tortoises, and there's a national park, and there's an area that was trees were cut down. Probably it was planted as crops for a few years. Rainfall was too heavy for the soil to be retained. When the trees are gone, everything erodes, and you end up within 5 or 10 years, with just absolute wasteland. So that's a big problem, and it's not going to go away. Another big problem that is mainly a problem in Asia is the fact that turtles and tortoises are food items, right? So if you go into a market in Beijing, Shanghai, many other places in China, you'll see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of turtles stacked in trays for sale. These days, fortunately, most of them are farm-raised. Most of them are Chinese soft-shell turtles, and most of those are raised on farms by the millions every year in southern China for food. And that's the system that works. We're not really sure if that system really is reducing pressure on wild turtles and tortoises in Asia. We do know that the other countries that surround China, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, have essentially zero turtles because they've all been taken away across the border into China because the Chinese economy is booming and there are middle-class people who can afford now to buy turtles to eat, and so that's an enormous problem. And here are some elongated tortoises being bargained for on the streets in China. And then the pet trade, my feeling is, to say this at the outset, is that one of the differences between the work I do and my other job, which is studying great apes, which are also endangered, and tortoises, is that we can breed tortoises in captivity. Zoos, you have to have a big zoo to keep even one gorilla, or a family of gorillas. And even then, they reproduce so slowly, much more slowly than people do, that captive breeding will never save great apes. But captive breeding can save tortoises because they can be bred so easily, many other species. And I think that private breeders and collectors can make a huge contribution, especially when they focus on just one or a few species that they're really into, and they dedicate their time, people like Ralph, dedicate their time and really learn about the biology of the species. They can make a big contribution. But as we all know, there also is an ongoing illegal trade, smuggling trade in tortoises and turtles, and many other kinds of wildlife. We know that some of the smuggling routes across the Pacific Ocean, the money to be generated from the illegal smuggling and sale of turtles and tortoises rivals the drug trade along those same routes. It's a huge money issue. These photos were taken in a market in Bangkok. I've been going to Thailand for my work, and basically the world's biggest flea market is a place called Chatuchak Market in Bangkok. It's an amazing place to go shopping for a day. But there's one little corner of that market that is reptile shops. And the vendors there have on display lots of endangered species that they certainly didn't breed them, they didn't acquire them legally, they were smuggled in, we know from undercover studies, usually star tortoises that are smuggled in from India, and then other species, radiated, smuggled in from Madagascar. They get to Bangkok, they end up being sold in the shops and under the banner of being captive bred, but they were not.